everybody, and welcome to On the Road to DevHops. Normally, Bryan Finster and I get together in the evening, we raise a glass and we toast the end of another day. But today we've got a special friend with us. So we're drinking coffee.
Gatorade.
Bryan, why don't you introduce our friend who we have with us today, and we'll get started on this really cool conversation.
Now, we're really happy to get Dave Farley back on here, and Dave is a co-author of Continuous Delivery and several other books, including my favorite one I keep pushing, which is Modern Software Engineering. So glad it's an audiobook now, so people can listen to it, because people don't read books. But Dave, welcome back.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And
guys, yeah, you're drinking coffee too? Are you sure there's nothing else in there? Because I know that it's later in the day for you.
Well, I'm going to say it's coffee.
I like that. I like that. Hey, we wanted to get together and chat about the whole hubbubaloo about generative AI and, well, how people are seeming as though it's giving them some productivity gains, but there's also a lot of fear that's going on. And let's dispel what's happening right now, because as we know, things are changing and they're going to change really fast. It's not as though what we say today is probably going to be gone in 6 months.
So, well, there's a few things though. Mm-hmm. There's also the marketing hype.
Oh gosh, yes.
The breathless marketing hype. So we need to talk about that as well.
Well, anybody who has a product right now tags and AI onto it, or AI powered. I noticed that at the RSA conference earlier this month, or I guess at the end of April. As you walk down the aisles of all of these massive booths, everything had AI powered, AI somewhere. However, when you talk to them, it was basically reporting or logging. It was not actually algorithms that were being executed against things.
It's the new .com.
Oh gosh, yes. It's the new cloud. It's the new agile. It's the new DevOps. It's the new DevSecOps. It's the buzzword du jour. And people are learning some of the other terms like LLM, large language model, and generative AI. So they're getting them. But I want to start out. So November rolls around. OpenAI releases ChatGPT. People kind of perked up and started playing and having fun. Then all the floodgates opened and the world claims that they're now generating all of their code and they are analyzing code quality. They're also looking at workflows. They're doing architectural analysis. All right, what are you guys actually seeing on the ground right now? Dave, why don't we start with you? What are you seeing?
I'm seeing people using tools like Copilot as I don't know. I think largely kind of smart search. So it's slightly more than that, but I don't see the other stuff. Really, there's some stuff in terms of being able to do smarter analyses of code and pull things out, but I'm not really seeing people generating what I'd think of as real world systems this way yet.
Yeah, I had the same experience with experimenting.
I'm a bit less skeptical than Bryan. I think there's something real here and something real going on, but that we're at the starter. But absolutely, I think all of the stuff is well overhyped.
I believe that we are absolutely embryonic right now, but we are going to take a step back in a couple of years and say, where were you when ChatGPT was released? Where were you? Because there's that much massive transition happening. It is so contrived at this point. I did work with Copilot. Even their own website, as of 3 Fridays ago, said 26% of the code that's generated is accepted by the users. So they're far, far, far away from code generation. They're still really code completion on steroids. Like lacking context is one of the biggest things I see. Is like, that's great that you can give me this one function, but you're not there's no reuse, there's no contextualization, at least not yet.
Yeah.
But,
so I've done several actual tried things out. Mm-hmm. And it's not that I'm skeptical that this is going to be a useful tool. I'm skeptical of the people saying we're going to replace developers, or we can use this as a replacement for paired programming, or any of that stuff. What I've seen is that you actually have to know what you're doing. It's not it's not like, oh, we can just hire entry-level developers and they can pair with this super smart thing. Well, it's not smart, right? You have to know what you're doing. But the other thing that when I'm playing around with it, people who don't have a test-first mindset are going to fail to use it.
Yeah.
That I think that from a, Copilot is less capable than I've seen ChatGPT as far as understanding what I want it to do and giving me something. Now, I'll say that most of the code it sends me is garbage at the moment, but I'm sure that'll improve. But I can see a point in the future where if you know how to do behavior-driven development and really describe and testable acceptance criteria, what's going to happen, that it could actually generate something useful.
I think that's where software development is going to go in the near term, near to medium term future. Absolutely, is that there are going to be probably there's still going to be people doing some kinds of hardcore stuff where they're trying to, manipulate squeeze the last ounce of performance or whatever it is out of a computer. That's still going to be the role of people for a while yet. For general development, I think it's going to go exactly down that BDD route. The skills, essentially, it's what you do now with ChatGPT. If you want it to write some code, is that you draft a series, you give it a series of examples, descriptions of what it is that you want that is accurate enough to be able to get what you want, and it fills in the gaps. That's programming. It's just programming in a different kind of language. It's programming in natural language rather than in a programming language, but it's still programming.
But Bryan brings up a great point, and that is we're seeing right now the newer in career, the new developers, they're trying this out, but they don't have the context. They don't have the understanding. They don't know what's wrong with what's being generated. They're learning how to generate prompts. Prompt engineering is something we're going to have to really pay attention to and help, with that natural language aspect. But it is the experienced person, I believe, right now, who is going to get the most benefit in the near term, because they do have that mindset and they can look at the code and they can make a choice. If I use Tab 9 or Copilot, it doesn't just give me one answer. It actually gives me multiple answers, and I can click through them and pick the one that best suits, because it's only generating language. It is, right? And programming language is language. So it is doing the statistical analysis to say, this is likely. But when I hit regenerate, it gives me something completely different, right? Based on rules. Without context, without somebody to help and describe what those differences are, I don't know, Bryan, to your point, that it's actually going to help somebody newer in career to understand why pick A over B.
Yeah, let me give you a real life example. So a friend of mine, I was talking to them about some strange code she was getting from one of the developers on her team. And she and one of the other seniors were trying to figure out, he's picking this weird dependency that we would never use. And this was shortly after ChatGPT started getting a bunch of hype. And as an experiment, she sent the coding problem to ChatGPT, and guess what got spit out? And so they were getting, it's not just does it solve the problem, but it's also does it solve the problem using the patterns we want, with maintainable code, with dependencies we approve, and so you have to be, it's not a replacement for knowledge. It's a replacement for typing. Yeah. I mean, it reduces the amount of boilerplate if you're a knowledgeable developer, but I've seen so many people say, yeah, all these prima donna developers, we're going to be able to replace them with a bunch of junior typists. And like outsourcing didn't work when you sent it to India. It definitely won't work when you send it to a large language model.
I think this is very closely related to what I see as the kind of low code, no code problem.
Exactly. Which
is ignoring the same problem, which is that, fundamentally to me, it's the real heart of what it is that we do. Software development isn't primarily about the bloody typing. It's about the thinking and the problem solving and the organizing of your work and the systems that we built so that it's maintainable and we can go back to it and all of those sorts of things. And to do that over decades, we software developers have built up a set of tools and approaches that work. So we need version control, we need exception handling, we need modularity and structure in our codes and separation of concerns and all of those good things we need. And there's no reason at all why ChatGPT or any of these things that are just trained on random code on the internet is necessarily going to come up with those, because most code doesn't look like that. It ought to, but it doesn't. And so just training them that way is not going to get us there. The other thing I think that's crucial is that I played with ChatGPT, and it's happily generate code that doesn't compile, because it's not testing that. It's not looping round and figuring out whether what it's generating actually works. It's not trying that, and it will have to do that at some point.
Yes. So I want to add in a word here. Well, hold on, Brian. I want to add in a word here. The word is it doesn't do it yet. And it may not be ChatGPT. It may be there are multiple large language models that are being trained. There are multiple massive tech companies now, small ones. There are people actually standing up. I'm part of a little group locally. We're standing up a large language model on our own little bit of infrastructure and playing with it. My point is, we're going to see that change. Right now, it doesn't understand. Any language model doesn't have the broader context. It doesn't know the dependencies. It hasn't consumed all of my SBOMs. It doesn't know those things. And I thoroughly believe that it will. And I want to track back to something else you said about low code, no code. Go ahead.
I had a point to follow up on David.
Okay.
All right. I've seen people say that it's a really good as a training model, that you can use it to train new people. Well, I'm currently working on stuff with GitHub Actions, and coming from my background, I never used GitHub Actions before. So I'm trying to learn how to use GitHub Actions, right? And I sent a something that was relatively simple to ChatGPT and asked it to send me the action to go and do that. It wasn't even syntactically correct for GitHub Actions.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of the challenge I had. There's a company I've worked for quite a number of years. That was not my first programming job. I joined that company, and they were doing most of the development in Informix 4GL and C, which I'd used in my previous company. And 4GL is not a language that's used in college. And I joined that company, and I'm looking at the code, and all the code was being written by people who learned to write Informix 4GL by reading bad contractor code.
Yeah.
And I can see a direct analogy here.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that we will see some interesting uses around translation. So I've got a big batch of Ada code that has not been documented. What does that do? We can start to say, explain what this does to me. So we've actually been experimenting with, I've been experimenting with it, and I'm getting okay results. Not the best, not the worst, but also experienced. I agree with the point that it is not yet ready to train the new neophyte. It's just not there. But there's another thing that I want to track back to around low code, no code. The reason for the rise in no code and low code environments is that we don't have enough technologists, we don't have enough developers, so we've got to provide a way, an on-ramp for development. No code for those who truly are business and don't understand much more than the configurations, and that's fine. It then becomes our job as platform designers and engineers to put as much of the smarts into the platform, codifying the good behaviors. Same thing with low code. It'll be interesting to see how AI is actually embedded and consumed within the low code, no code environment. They've actually been faster. Prior to ChatGPT, they were already incorporating the use of AI and algorithms into these low code and no code platforms to help them understand their quality, to help them do some refactoring. So there's some smart things that have already been happening in the low code, no code world using this. What's going to be interesting is to watch those two different, very different paradigms and where they start to merge together. I think we are definitely going to see more generation. It's going to have to be smarter generation, but to your point, the quality, the testing, the embedding it within the contextualization of all of the other aspects of the enterprise or of that system of systems, it's going to be a massive importance.
Yeah, and you know, a fundamental part of our kind of work is to go and have to modify things once they're already there. And you were saying about earlier on, you were saying the thing about the tool sort of present you a bunch of just textual options of the code, pick the code that you like. But you can only do that if the code's tiny, because you can't just look at it and say, oh, it's great and it all works without testing it. You don't know. All of us, no doubt, here have had the experience of writing 3 lines of code and 2 of them had bugs in. It's just the way it works. So you have to validate all of those things as you go, and we've learned that we must work in small steps. That's not how these things are working at all yet. But I want to come back to what you said though, Tracy, is that we've got one foot on the on-ramp here, and we don't know how steep the on-ramp is. So it might be weeks or decades before this thing completely replaces programming, but it's probably it's in that range. It's not longer than decades.
Yeah, no, I don't want anybody to believe that it's going to happen tomorrow, despite the LinkedIn posts about, the massive amount of productivity gains. My guidance to everybody associated with me is, if it takes you longer to write a prompt than it would to turn around and ping Dave Farley, ping Brian, ping somebody on your team and say, let's talk this through. If it takes you longer than that, it's a problem, because it's not a productivity gain at that point. It's an experiment. It's a toy.
Yeah.
Well, and there's 2 things I want to touch on. One is, Dave's point that most of our job is not greenfield development. Most of our job is modifying something that exists and suffering through the last developer's decisions. And how do you give the entire context of what it is you're trying to do with that code to at least the current generation? But the other thing is, if we can start replacing developers with something that today I would not call AI, well, if you can replace a developer, it actually is AI. And at that point, is it ethical to turn it off? Because to replace a developer, you need to have a system that can solve problems, and that's a human activity. That takes sentience.
I'm no longer sure of that. I think there are already examples of AI solving problems. So if that's true, we're already there. So there are problems. So I think this is a bad phrase from a previous era, but there's the concept of kind of the idiot savant from years ago of something that's not smart but superhuman in kind of narrow context. And I think we are there now. There are lots of areas where these AIs are smarter than us. The protein folding problem was unsolvable, and AI has solved it. AlphaFold has solved it for virtually all of the proteins that we know about. These things don't think like us. They think differently to us, but they are certainly capable of original solutions to problems. There was something I read about recently where it was solving maths problems that people, in an innovative way that people hadn't been able to tackle before. So I think we're there, but the impact on development, fundamentally, the impact, the current limitation, as far as I see it, on the technology, I don't think is many steps away. And I think the scary thing, the reason why this is being so hyped, I think there's a mix of hype and real news going on here, because I think this is genuinely a genuine step change. And I think that one of the next step that people are talking about, and they're talking about doing it, that people are already experimenting this with GPT-4, which is plugging it into other behaviors so it can run the code, it can get the feedback, it can learn from that feedback. That's a step change in kind of the evolution of the smartness of these things, and that's going to make a difference, I think.
On building on what both you and Brian have brought up, test driven, being test first. We're now seeing tab 9 just rolled out a beta technology that is generating tests to your code base. So they're starting to get after that, starting to. And again, I'm always I don't want to say a hater, but I always come into this pragmatically going, how embryonic is the first offering? If we are able to get after it.
That's not the first offering. I've been evaluating technologies like that for management for a decade.
I agree. And the language models are what are changing this, is that the ability of these LLMs, and there's multiple different LLMs, not as though there's just one. The ability, right? The number of parameters, the way they're trained in the first place. One of the things that we haven't hit on yet is the training of the models. ChatGPT is just ChatGPT. It's trained by, but there are others who have stood up that same GPT-4 or GPT 3.5, and they're leveraging that and they're training it themselves. So they're not using what has been provided by OpenAI, they're providing their own data. So imagine this world where you stand it up on behalf of the government. You see Nick Shalon has stood up something called Ask Sage. He did the same thing. He worked with Microsoft. It is hosted on Azure, but he has limited the type of data that can come in, the classifications of the data that are coming in. I could and should be doing that same thing around different development languages. We should be looking at how we can impact the training of the models as much as the consumption of the models. And I think that it's kind of our imperative to get after some of the quality aspects of that up front.
So I've talked to Nick and seen some of the conversations around that, but the primary use case for that is honestly doing something that's it should be good at, which is writing contracts, which is mostly boilerplate. Right. And save a lot of time on creating contracts or government work, because it's just almost always the same thing all the time. Right. There's not a lot of problem solving going on in those contracts. But there's something else I wanted to touch on, because you said, hey, people are using, GPT to write tests. Well, I mean, okay, great. So what I've done is I can write tests for what the existing behavior is, and it says it works this way. Probably not structured well. I've tried that and didn't come out with really good tests. I sent a well-known open source virtual service tool that I like to use, Montebank. I pointed ChatGPT at one of the files of Montebank and asked it to test it. And it spit out nothing but, it was 100% mocks. It didn't actually test anything, but it gave 100% code coverage.
To be fair, I've met developers that have done that as well.
I know, no, believe me. And this is one of the things I push all the time is never, ever, ever demand a code coverage minimum. Don't ever impose that on a team, because you will get shitty tests.
I'm having that argument with a team right now. We need this percentage.
I have data and multiple experience reports I can give on that. But the other thing is, I saw a blog post that's one of the blog posts that prompted, hey, we should really have this discussion. TDD is dead, because you don't need to do TDD, because you can just have ChatGPT write the test for you. But that entirely misunderstands why a test first mindset's required, right? And why my proposition is that understanding how to effectively do behavior-driven development, how to structure tests, specification by example will be important, is because you're testing that it does what you told it to do, instead of that it's doing what it should.
It's fun. I was going to make the same point, is that, okay, so they're doing that, but that's a stupid idea. And even, once the AIs do get smarter than us, they'll stop doing that, because it's ludicrous, because it's a self-referential system at that point. So even if I can write the code, all it's saying is, yes, that's the code that you wrote. That's no use. That when I change the code, the test doesn't fit anymore. So they'll write some new test and say, yes, it's still the code it's now the new code that you wrote. All these tests still doesn't tell you what.
This history book is correct because the book said so.
Yeah.
I like it.
So I agree entirely. You've got to do the test first. You've got to say, this is what we want it to do. Now make it do that. Interestingly, I did try that with an earlier version of ChatGPT when it was GPT 3.5. And surprisingly, it did a reasonably good job for a few goes when I was doing simple things. I did choose an example that it had probably seen in its learning, which might have helped. I don't know, but I was doing FizzBuzz. So I wrote some tests for FizzBuzz, and it just it just wrote the code that worked. And I went, well, I was blown away by that, actually. Then I ran it again, and it gave me some different code that solved an entirely different problem and didn't make the test pass. And I went, yeah. So it was hallucinating as well. But you know, with that feedback loop, you can close that. But writing tests after the fact, that's just, you know, wishful thinking. That's not going to add any value.
Let's talk about, or let's explore some of the other uses of generative AI around the SDLC, because we've just kind of focused on the code pieces of it, which to us, right, is the jimmies on the sprinkles on the ice cream, so to speak. You touched on contracts and the language pieces, which are part of an SDLC that can become a part of it. I've been working with it and playing with it in terms of helping to generate user stories and having people work through that. And so they're using natural language to get those back in user story format. I do find it helpful there as a jumpstart for the true neophyte, because it's not code. They're getting their arms around how to do that. I think it would be better to have a human coach or a human mentor or be interactive. But there are probably some use cases there where we can leverage some of these tools to get after some things. Have you guys played with it with any of the other pieces of the SDLC?
Well, just as an aside, back in several years ago, I had some workshops with Paul Hammond, and I stopped using user stories. I just started focusing on the acceptance tests. Anyway, Dave, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly my take as well. I coach people to use user stories, and then as a step in the translation process. But there is a step that we whiz past fairly quickly to get to the examples that we then turn into the executable specifications. And as I said earlier, I think that's a more powerful approach than most people give it credit for. I think it's one of the things that in my work, where I'm kind of consulting with organizations and helping them to transform into doing better engineering. It's one of those things that when I explain it, you can kind of see the light bulbs going off over people's heads and going, oh, right, I didn't get that. And nearly every group that I've explained it to have adopted that strategy in some way or another, because it's so obviously powerful, I think. So I certainly think that's the case. I think, and I think that's the kind of thing where I think it's going to be quite, we're going to have more serious trouble than software development being overtaken by AIs at the point at which the artificial general intelligence can do that, because that's now saying, what is it that people really want? How do we evaluate that? That's a very creative, broad kind of intelligence, it seems to me, in terms of thinking about the overall design of the system. Some people struggle with that, in my experience, and so I think it's going to be a big deal when the AIs can do that. I haven't seen anybody attempting to use AI for that kind of thing. All of it that I've seen has been kind of the more kind of naive use of writing a bit of code that we've been
smaller, more transactional bits that they're asking for. I want this. It gives you this small segment and hunk back.
And I think, as Brian and I have been talking about, as both of us being proponents of acceptance testing, the step from an executable specification to a large language model prompt is a tiny one.
It is.
And I've seen, I've fed Gherkin straight into ChatGPT and gotten code out. It's like there's no step. As far as to your point, though, Tracy, when it comes to, you know, what should the system do and what do people want? I don't think that a large language model is going to give us that, but it'd be very interesting to see what would happen if you could instrument things. So I don't see it helping us with effectiveness. Like, this is useful. I see it helping with efficiency, though. So what if we were able to instrument everything, and so it can do a value stream analysis and tell us where we have constraints?
I think it'd be fantastic across, if we were to put it across the entire flow and to be able to see where those constraints are. Absolutely.
You know,
I'm not sure that we
architectural changes or team structure changes or both.
I'm not sure that we're that far away from that now. The data is there. It's pointing the models at it.
No, I agree. I think we could do that. I mean, if you pinpoint, hey, you've got this service over here that's just terribly designed. It has way too many dependencies. You should really try to look at this, you know, and look at the entire way the system's working and start trying to suggest ways to make it more efficient.
Well, there is initial work being done on architectural analysis, the engine, you know, looking at the entire code base, looking at how an entire ecosystem and projecting where there are, you know, finding duplications in the code, but also looking at the quality. So there are initial experiments that are being done in that realm. So I do think we're going to see that. I've seen it in, it escapes me offhand. I'll find it and post it in the links afterwards. There are some low-code platforms that have that available to it, because you do, in low-code platforms, you do create a certain amount of code. And so it is finding where there are efficiencies. To your point, though, Brian, take it back a step to who are the development, you know, what's the development team, or where's the friction coming from a timing perspective across the entire value stream flow?
Yeah.
I think it could be wildly impressive. I want to track back to something that Dave brought up about the user experience, about being for having any kind of generative model, whether it's ChatGPT or not, be able to understand or to be able to project what they think humans would want. There's some additional interesting research that's being done with human factors engineering and those aspects of it. So understanding how people are interacting, not just through the quantitative pieces, but of starting to understand qualitatively, being fed some information from those users. So there are models starting to evolve that can then look at something as it's being designed, or better yet, project out, this is an effective, I don't know, pizza ordering system, for lack of something better. But we will see more of those jump starts start to be there for the more common business needs. Now, obviously not for more advanced systems.
I was wondering about that as we were talking, that kind of thing. So I'm interested to hear that there's been some work in that. I hadn't come across that, but I am slightly skeptical about how far that can take until we get to, you know, probably full-blown artificial general intelligence. And the reason for that is that I think that, you know, we struggle with that because, you know, we can talk about stability and throughput as generic measures for software development. And after that, we're struggling because there aren't really many more. Everything else after that's contextual. Is, you know, is this feature hoping to, you know, get more signups? Is this feature hoping to, you know, bring, you know, make more money? Is this feature intended to reduce latency? And there's a lot of different things, and I'm not quite sure how. I'm not quite sure it's easy enough to be able to build a model where you can kind of synthesize all of that data, and because it's very, very complicated and very, very targeted.
What if we feed in what if the feedback is automatically ingested into these models so that they're, because we're doing that in operations and operational monitoring, we are automatically, right, collecting that information and rejiggering the model with all of the data real time. So perhaps if we think about it for the SDLC, would it not be possible, if we're getting feedback from users, if we're seeing that, might it not be possible to more quickly train the model to understand what our needs are?
This is something else I wanted to touch on, which is people trust machine. For some reason, People trust information coming out of ChatGPT more than they trust information coming from people. And
because it sounds confident. It's because it sounds confident.
No, I
Sounds
agree,
confident.
but it's still GIGO, the very first acronym any of us are supposed to learn, right? And if you can do hypothesis-driven development, and you can tell this, language models or AI, I hate that term, but tell it, hey, we're going to go and we're going to add this feature. We should see this increase in sales, right? But it's only as smart as how you tell it to calculate that you were successful or not. But when the machine, you can start having confirmation bias because you've already determined that it's successful by this metric, and it reports the metric. So yeah, it's successful, but now I see people delegating reason to these things.
Well, so the language models, generative language models, generate new content, but it does do it smartly, right? Using statistical analysis. So it isn't as though it is only regurgitating directly what's been fed in. I mean, there is synthesis of, right? And so I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, right? I do think that we're going to see a lot on the horizon, but we've got to be realistic right now. The important thing, and I think the reason we're having this conversation is, hey, peeps, you're not going to lose your job tomorrow. Don't depend on this for everything. Be intelligent. I have been talking in multiple forums and saying the first thing that anybody needs to do is turn around to their organization and say, who's playing with this? What are you doing with it? And get a handle on it because we're sending important information. We're sending PII. We're sending corporate data, right? Apple just blocked their people from using this because they were having leaks in this way.
Well, but I want to bring it back to the psychology thing, right?
Okay.
Because I think this is an important thing that people aren't really looking at enough, is that they trust it. For some reason, people trust the responses. And I've seen all sorts of people running experiments. Somebody asked it to give it some analysis of something, and it cited sources that didn't exist. It was just complete falsification of sources.
I recently fed it an entire blog post. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
It lies really well, very confidently, and people get used to trusting it instead of getting used to saying, well, it's probably plagiarizing something or making stuff up.
I was going to say it's the making stuff up that is the real worry to me. I fed in direct material that I knew every word that was there and asked for a summary. And I got to tell you, it was complete and total BS, even though I had fed in the information and the prompt was well orchestrated. It was a summary of a person that I had interviewed. And so it told me that this person was involved in theater. I'm like, no, that was a Navy officer, not involved in theater. They're not a communications major. Where did you come up with this contrived stuff? Now, there is interesting attributions that are going on with other services like Perplexity. If you ask for something, when it generates it and gives it to you, it's got the footnotes, and you can actually go then and look at the link. At least you feel some sense of, if you're like us, the three of us, you feel more sense of confidence because you at least go and look at where it tried to stitch things together. But Brian, you've nailed it on the head. The reason that people tend to believe it is that it immediately comes back as though it is confident. Words are well articulated, sentences are well structured, there's a believability to it. And so we naturally are extending that to code. Stop it. Stop it. Don't believe what you see.
The first test I gave it was, when should I use Git flow versus trunk-based development? And so that right there will tell you that it has no idea what it's talking about. Go try.
That's why you didn't like it. I just wanted to wind back. I agree with all of those things, but I just wanted to wind back a little bit to what we were talking about, is the different places that we could potentially use this in the software development lifecycle. And one of the other places that we haven't mentioned yet that intrigues me, and you come across Adam Thornhill's stuff about the your code base as a crime scene. And the sort of metadata analysis and all those sorts of things. He's got a company called Code Scene where they've got tools that will infer all sorts of interesting information, knowledge from the code scene. I don't think they're doing significant AI techniques yet, but I think that will come as well, and we'll be able to get more information about, you know, what's going on, and not just you know static code analysis or anything like that, but team dynamics, team organization insights, and those sorts of things. I would imagine that we will be able to see those sorts of things across that. We got this big data resource, which are our repos, and commit history and all of that sort of stuff. And there's an awful lot of stuff that you can learn from that if you apply some smarts to it. And Adam's company does, and he talks about some things, but I think there's more things to do.
You just gave me an idea. There's a woman named Duina Blostrom, and she has created a platform. Her company is called People Not Tech. And what's interesting about it is it goes in and it helps to assess the trust that is there. And it does it in a way that is not weaponized. In my mind, is how interesting would it be to take the flow metrics that we're talking about, all the flow data that we're talking about, and add in a real human context about the trust, not just the organizational structure. I could see there being some really interesting and possibly terrifying outcomes from this. Like, Dave, you're fired. Why? Well, Chat Bryan said you're gone.
What would it mean if every time that Bryan committed something, I went in and I changed it? It would be saying that we're having an argument through the code base. I've seen that happening. So there's all sorts of weirdly human things that we could infer from those sorts of things, and no doubt people will be at some point. But
well, just to plug my own scaling framework, in scaled agile DevOps, we actually have released a new service called HR as a service. So it's harass for short. And what the system does is it just goes and looks at it's an AI-driven thing. It goes and looks at all of your commit history and defect rates, and then automatically terminates people.
Excellent.
And that's through the SATMF. Is that through the SATMF site?
SATMF.com. So that maintains psychological safety for management. They don't have to be confronted with that.
Bryan. We did an episode, Dave, a while ago, and it was specifically on how sarcasm can help us to deal with these situations. We have to laugh at the absurdity as opposed to just always fretting over the fact that things are crazy.
Well, but honestly, I can see where that might actually become a thing. I just wrote a blog post that's going to be published this week, talking about individual metrics tools, things like Get Prime and other tools like that. LinearB does this as well, where it reports how individual developers get metrics. Now throw that at an AI system to stack rank people automatically, and see what that does. See what that does to the productivity of your organization and morale. Right? I can see people doing that and like hyper weaponizing it.
Yeah.
Just because they're too dumb to understand what they're doing to their organization.
Yeah.
There are other scary things that are happening that are really tangential, but worth verbalizing. The interview process has been highly automated right now, so that you get in and you are answering your video. Nobody's on the other end. You're answering questions. They're studying your face. They're doing facial analysis to understand, are you lying? Are you nervous? So I think that there's some interesting and scary tangents to this concept of dehumanizing the human. Let's figure out how we can tag you, meta tag you. What are the metrics? What are the measures for you as a human? And we'll see what happens with that compartmentalization. It's a slippery slope. You, Bryan, and I both disagree with going after individual developer metrics to the extent, we need to know when somebody's having a hard time. But the weaponizing of metrics is what we have to avoid.
Yeah, you can't measure that someone's having a hard time.
Yeah. People will try.
Go to the Gemba, coached by walking around, find out, go see.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I feel at this point I have to, we keep talking about just stepping onto the on-ramp and this is going somewhere. I am in the camp of people that I think this is probably the most scary thing that's ever happened to humanity. Ultimately, I don't know where that plays out. I don't know how long it takes, but I'm in that camp, and I think, you know, I think we have to start to do things to try to control this, and not just, you know, look at it and go, oh gee, isn't this exciting?
Well, but Dave, we know, we've seen several documentaries from in our history about where this is going. The first one was Colossus, the Forbidden Project. You saw it in Terminator 2, Terminator 3. I mean, we know where this goes if we don't have a handle on it, right? You know, we have Isaac Asimov who's told us where it goes if we do it correctly. You know, so I don't know what to tell you.
So I think it's the greatest invention. You know, people keep comparing it to things like nuclear weapons and, you know, the internet and all that stuff. I think the best example that I can come up with is this is the invention of fire. You know, it's both hugely useful and hugely destructive.
Exactly. That is a fantastic analogy. It really is, because I am wonderfully scared of it. I'm in awe of it. And there's a certain energy if we harvest it. I think one of the things that are going to be difficult is, to Brian's point, joking about HR, I think that there are going to be ways that people use that are not holistic, that are not caring of others, that are looking at the bottom dollar only and not caring about humanity. I think we're going to see a measure of on both sides of this, right? It's happened throughout history. How can we, as a technology community, better participate so that we can help to steer it in the right direction?
Yes, absolutely, and you know, apply some kind of. I don't want to bring this down, but apply some kind of ethical thinking about this in the context of, as you've been talking, you know, the impact on human beings. Because, you know, the early stages of the on-ramp, you know, before we get to the Terminator stages, it's evil people doing, or stupid people doing stupid things with the technology, like automating HR and interviews and those sorts of things, that are going to create bad consequences. So you know, we've got to start thinking about those sorts of things. And just I think it's a bit late in the day, but I'm pleased that some, you know, the recent things this week about the people standing up and saying, you know, the thing that this could be an existential threat, the document that was signed this week or whatever, those sorts of things. You know, we need to be talking about this sort of stuff. We need to be coming up. You know, we can do this. I saw an interview with the physicist Max Tegmark yesterday, and he was pointing out we've done this before. You know, you don't get to just invent a new medicine and put it out for everybody. We have rules and approaches that we have to go through to validate that it's safe. But we just need those sorts of things for these sorts of technologies as well. But we've got to start implementing them.
So here's how I'd like to end today. I'd like to invite you back 6 months, because I think this is going to move that quickly. And let's touch base again in 6 months and bring everybody along in the journeys. We are all engaged with multiple different clients, different organizations. We're not working holistically for one group only. So that gives us an interesting purview. I'd love for us to get back together. Dave, thank you so much for being here today. And Brian, it's always good, though. We really were drinking some bland stuff today. Anything you'd like to close with that you'd like to leave for folks to think about?
Yeah, if we're coming back in 6 months, can we do it at whiskey time?
Yes, yes. Absolutely. Brian, any final thoughts from you, sir?
Yeah, I for one welcome our machine overlords.
Oh my goodness, I'm glad we're just starting the day. I'm going to go get another coffee. For everybody who's listening, we'd love to get your comments and your feedback. Look at the links below. We'll have information on Dave and Dave's books, as well as some of the articles and research that we referenced in today's show. That's it. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.
Always a pleasure.